Hello and welcome back. We're continuing reading through the Bible Jesus Read by Philip Yancey. And we're in chapter 3, Deuteronomy, a taste of bittersweet. So let's get started. Moses' life had a single theme: God did it. How many times had his mother recounted the tale of his miraculous survival during the Pharaoh's campaign to exterminate Hebrew babies? God saved you, Moses, she told him over and over. He has something very special in mind for you. She laughed, that proud mother's laugh, as she reminded him that God arranged for her, his birth mother, to get a royal pension for nursing him. Meanwhile, he played in the courts of Pharaoh, acquired a superb classical education, and dined with the elite of the empire. Secretly knowing his true identity, Moses felt like a person without a country. When other Egyptian princes told crude jokes about the Hebrew slaves, he bit his tongue. When his own people, the Hebrews, taunted him for his uppity manners and palace accent, he bit his tongue again. He loved both families, birth and adopted. He never tired of the peasant family dinners, followed by the old men rehashing stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the God they still worship, despite the fact that he seemed to have fallen asleep for a dozen generations. Moses especially loved the story of Joseph. "You could be a new Joseph," said his mother as she kissed him goodbye one night. "You too walked in Pharaoh's palace. God may use you to help save us." On the other hand, he could not imagine life without the training he got every day from the smartest students in the empire. He loved the sports competitions, the feasts, the fine wine, the oiled and perfumed women who taught him art and music. Like a spy, he balanced the two worlds successfully, keeping them in sealed compartments and flourishing in both, until one day the two collided and he had to choose between them. At the time, it seemed simple matter of justice. Dressed in the full regalia of an Egyptian prince, a gold headpiece and buckle announcing his office, he visited a work site of the pharaoh. There he saw a mid-level Egyptian foreman savagely beating a Hebrew, one of Moses' countrymen. He gave the tyrant a shove, finished him off, and hid the corpse in the sand, then went on as if nothing had happened. Others had seen the deed, though, and now the cat had escaped the bag. On that day at the worksite, Moses realized what side he was truly on. Egyptians used the word hapiru as a term of scorn for Hebrews, the dusty ones. If an Egyptian dies, of course, someone must pay. But if one of the hapiru dies, who cares? I care, Moses decided. They may be slaves, but they are my kinsmen. No one deserves this treatment. To Pharaoh, Moses had crossed a line and got caught on the wrong side. He could not tolerate insurrection. It was, after all, he who had ordered the infanticide campaign against Moses' tribe. Pharaoh issued a death warrant for the impostor prince named Moses. A fugitive, Moses fled Egypt and for 40 years had no contact with either of his families. A new life began that surprisingly suited him, the lonely life of a nomad. He gained a wife, an extended family, and a new set of wilderness survival skills. Out of prudence, Moses said little to anyone about his past and had little reason to. No one in Midian cared about the Hebrews, nor about the Egyptians for that matter. His world gradually shrank into a circle of domestic tranquility, and at the ripe old age of 80, he concerned himself mainly with children, in-laws, and sheep. God, however, had other plans. While Moses was forging a new life in Midian, far from the Hebrew slaves, God had been listening to their groans. All at once, the slow, mysterious work of a timeless God came into sharp focus, revealing that nothing in Moses' circuitous life had been wasted. God now had a Hebrew of pure pedigree, expertly trained in Egyptian leadership skills, fully capable of surviving in the wilderness. The time for liberation of God's chosen people had arrived, now to convince Moses and Pharaoh. Moses raised powerful objections to God's plans. First, there was the question of his trustworthiness. Why should the Hebrews trust someone trained by the enemy? let alone a fugitive who had skipped the country for 40 years. Besides, both the Hebrews and Pharaoh would need an articulate leader to stir them into action. Why pick someone with a stutter? "Oh Lord, please send someone else," Moses begged. A few words spoken from a burning bush silenced Moses, convincing Pharaoh was another matter. Thus did a shepherd become the first intermediary chosen by God to speak to his people, and also the first person recorded in the Bible to work miracles. Moses' initial fears proved accurate, however. After an Egyptian crackdown doubled their workload, the Hebrews abandoned Moses and his brother Aaron. The Israelites were supposed to believe that a God absent for Pharaoh and his armies? Dream on. Moses did not even have the support of his own people. As he strode up the massive stone steps to Pharaoh's palace, its gold finials gleaming in the desert sun, he looked around. The Pharaoh had nearly finished his grand construction plans. A city of white limestone, more dazzling than the sun, had grown up around the drab buildings he knew as a boy. Hieroglyphics carved into the stone walls said it all. Unused in 40 years, Moses' first language came flooding back as he studied the accounts of Pharaoh's military conquests. He felt a stab of pain as he recognized the Egyptian symbol for foreigner, a bound man with blood flowing from a wound in his hand. The wilderness of Midian had rid him of all nostalgia for the luxuries of Egypt. Sumptuous banquets, orgies, pretentious dress, with social rank carefully scripted in hair, armbands, and clothing styles, all this seemed a stench to him now. He knew his proper identity, a foreigner, an alien in a strange land, a Gershom, the very name he had chosen for his son. His people, the Hebrews, were the bound ones with blood flowing from their wounds. The Haparu, the dusty ones who worked in the mud and bore the lashes of the Egyptians. Their only hope, only future, now rested in God's hands alone. Why on earth would my appointment secretary admit this smelly goat herd? Thought Pharaoh, as on seeing but not yet recognizing Moses. The uncouth visitor whispered his words of introduction to Aaron, his interpreter, but no one could understand Aaron's rustic speech. When Moses finally spoke up, all the attendants drew back at the sound. Out of the rube's mouth flowed perfect aristocratic Egyptian. A few minutes later, Moses, the former prince of Egypt, and Pharaoh, the ruling king, were laughing together over the good old days. The Pharaoh's gold necklaces and bracelets jangled as he clapped his hands in joy. To the guard's astonishment, he even allowed the coarse visitor to touch him. The two had once been playmates. Before Moses had crossed the reigning Pharaoh, but the old man long dead was now resting in unimaginable splendor in the Valley of the Kings. "We put enough food and furniture in his tomb to keep him in comfort for eternity," said the new Pharaoh, his son. "Already I have 50,000 workmen preparing my own tomb. You can never be too careful." Anything Moses wanted he could have for himself, that is, not for the rest of the Hebrews. Think about it, Moses. Put yourself in my place. No monarch would let his main workforce just walk away. I have cities to build, and aqueducts, and forts. Though the Pharaoh did not say it, they both knew the Hebrew slaves did all the dirty work at minimal cost. "Come back to the palace and enjoy life," he urged. "Don't worry about the incident at the construction site. Just as Father promised, I am now Egypt, the morning and the evening star. If I say day is night, it will be so written. Join me and forget the Hebrews." God had not forgotten the Hebrews, however. "I have seen the oppression of my people in Egypt and have heard their cry," he told Moses from the burning bush. Neither could Moses forget his people. At one time, Pharaoh's offer might have tempted him, but not now. He looked back in shame on the days when he called Father the man who had slaughtered the Hebrew children. After 40 years in the wilderness, he had been unprepared for the sight of the slave labor again. It felt like a kick in the gut. Moses, in effect, flung down a gauntlet, challenging the mightiest empire in the world to a form of cosmic combat with the very heavens choosing sides. Soon Moses and the Pharaoh were engaged in a great tug of war. And not so different from the games they used to play in the courtyard, although now with stakes raised higher. "I will not be dictated to. I will not be threatened," shouted the Pharaoh, in a tone Moses had never heard before. "I am the morning and the evening star. I am Pharaoh." Egypt and its mighty God stood in splendid array against the invisible God of the Hebrews. To the Egyptians, the Hebrews' notion of a single invisible God seemed ludicrous. They worshipped an elaboration of gods who could be visually celebrated in the splendid temples. Horus, the hawk; Thoth, the ibis; Khnum, the ram; Apis, the sacred bull. Each possessed mysterious characteristics known only to the priests. What good was a god you could not see or even represent in sculpture or painting? As for the Hebrews' request to withdraw into the desert to offer sacrifice, they seemed an obvious escaped ploy. Did not the temple of Karnak down the river employ 70,000 full-time priests and acolytes? If the Hebrews wanted to sacrifice, why not hire the experts? Yet one by one the Egyptian gods fell to the plagues unleashed by Moses' God. The river god turned to blood. The sacred fly became a swarming pest. The sun god Ra disappeared behind a cloud. The great bull failed to protect his livestock. Finally, in the last and worst plague, the Pharaoh, along with every other Egyptian, lost his firstborn son. At last he conceded defeat. The invisible God had won. The very next day, Hebrew slaves, loaded down with Egyptian plunder, walked away in a huge ragtag mob, at the head of which marched Moses, Prince of Israel. Moses himself would have resisted the title, of course. From the moment he first saw the bush that would not stop burning, he had learned one lesson above all others. The mission was God's, not his. Moses merely played the role God assigned him. He tried to drum that lesson into the Israelites every year at Passover. When they remembered that last murderous night in Egypt, when no Israelite armies faced the mighty Egyptians, freedom came in the blackest night, while the Hebrew families huddled around the Passover table, their bags packed, waiting for deliverance. God alone did it. Later, when the Pharaoh changed his mind and set his chariots loose upon the fleeing tribes, and all the Israelites whimpered like cowards, God came through again. God even designated the Exodus as a way of describing himself. "I am the God who brought you out of Egypt." That same pattern of abject dependence would continue all through the wilderness wanderings. When the Hebrews ran out of water, God provided. When food supplies failed, God provided. When raiders attacked, God provided. Liberation was God's act, and he alone deserved the credit. Years of sheep herding during the exile in Midian had mellowed Moses, preparing him for the leadership role in the Sinai. In the old days, he took matters into his own hands. All three scenes from his youth involved violence: murdering an Egyptian foreman, breaking up a fight among brethren, chasing a bunch of shepherds away from some vulnerable women, and impressing his future wife in the process. Now the famous temper had softened. Once only did it rear up strongly enough to defy God himself, when Moses smashed his walking stick against a rock in anger. "You want water? I'll give you water," he had screamed at the thirsty whiners. That lapse cost him the dream of his life, the chance to set foot in the promised land. For a moment, Moses forgot it was God's work, not his own. And for this reason, he now stood on the tall rock before the anxious multitude on the wrong side of the Jordan River. And that's where we're going to end today. Hopefully you're enjoying this. Leave a comment down below, maybe something that you got out of this part of the chapter, and we will see you next week.